Good morning, all. I'm so glad that you could join us today. I know 8:30 in the morning is always a little difficult, but I think it's going to be well worth your time because we have a wonderful panel for you here today. Today, we're really going to start to look at issues impacting Montana a little more directly. Yesterday, we focused a lot on national energy development. Today, we're going to pull that back and look at energy development here in Montana. And specifically, we're going to be discussing transboundary impacts of energy development, namely proposals for coal mining in British Columbia and how that could potentially impact us here in Montana as British Columbia's neighbors to the south. Just by way of a roadmap, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the problem with these coal mines, and then I'm going to introduce each of our speakers individually before they actually begin their presentation. Now, interestingly, this matter is really another chapter in the ongoing relationship between Canada and the United States with energy development and environmental impacts. We had a really great case in international law, Trail Smelter, that came out at the beginning of last century that had to deal with environmental regulation between Canada and the United States, and we're seeing that that's still an issue in this region with regards to British Columbia and Montana. Specifically today, we're going to talk about the proposals for the expansion of coal mining north of Montana in the Flathead River Basin, which have raised some significant environmental concerns. Just to put it into perspective for you, the proposals would lead to a mine at the headwaters of the North Fork, Flathead River, which runs into the Flathead Lake. The mine would extract approximately 2 million tons per year of low-grade metallurgical coal and mix it with a higher-grade coal. The mine would operate approximately 24 hours a day, 365 days a year for 20 years. So this could have potentially some significant impacts. The criticism of these proposals in general is that it would have devastating consequences to Montana's and the Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribes, fish, wildlife, and recreation with zero economic benefit for the region, for Montana or for the tribe. Now, it's important to note that the permit applications are still pending with British Columbian authorities who have the authority to grant or deny the permit unless the Canadian federal government decides to intervene in this case. So right now that decision lies with British of Columbia. Now our Senator Max Baucus, has requested that the Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice intervene in this matter and request for greater review of the proposals. His concern is that the environmental assessment has not been stringent enough and has not fully vetted any environmental impacts in the area. Now specifically, if Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice were to request for review, her review request would go to the International Joint Commission, which is a panel of both American and Canadian experts charged with preventing and resolving international disputes between the U.S. and Canada. Just by way of a little bit of background, I know that Mr. Moy is going to go into greater detail on this, but the International Joint Commission was formed by the Boundary Water Treaty of 1909. The panel actually helped defeat similar proposals in 1998. And as I mentioned before, the United States Secretary of State must request the hearing. So this request must come from Secretary Rice. Secretary Rice has pressed for more stringent environmental assessment of the proposal's environmental impacts, arguing that the current environmental assessment doesn't consider downstream impacts or cumulative effects. And those of you who are currently in my Introduction to Environmental Law class, you know that cumulative effects is a big topic that we spend a lot of time talking about. Now, this case really raises some important issues. Obviously, we're going to discuss today the regulation of transboundary pollution. That's a question that has plagued environmental lawyers for decades as to how to best regulate transboundary pollution. But also I'd like to point out to you that this matter really raises some interesting questions of sovereignty. What is the extent of one sovereign's right to develop its natural resources when that development could potentially negatively impact other sovereigns? Here we have a sovereign nation, Canada, and its province, British Columbia, who are very interested in developing their natural resources, but the development could be to the detriment of two other sovereigns, the state of Montana and the Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribe. So these raise important questions. Now, today the panel is going to assume that negative impacts will occur from this mining. And therefore, we're going to move forward from that assumption on the panel and discuss the extent to which, essentially, sovereignty should be constrained. How much can Canada develop its natural resources? And is it possible, or should we allow, for Montana and the Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribe to be negatively impacted? Today, beginning our discussion, will be Rich Moy. We're very lucky to have Mr. Moy with us. And Mr. Moy has been the Chief of Water Management Bureau for the Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation for the past 27 years. In this position, he has dealt with most water resource policy, technical, and planning issues in Montana. He was instrumental in developing and implementing the State Water Plan and Montana's Drought Plan, addressing the protection of in-stream flows in the Missouri River and other river basins, setting up for the administrative structure for solving reserve water rights of Native Americans, and balancing the protection of senior water right holders against the need to protect for more contemporary issues of water rights. Over the past 25 years, Mr. Moy has worked extensively on regional water issues in the Missouri and Columbia River basins, and on international issues with the provinces of British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and the Canadian federal government. Mr. Moy was the United States Secretariat for the Flathead International Study Board that evaluated the potential impacts of a proposed coal mine in the headwaters of the Flathead River Basin of British Columbia between 1985 and 1988, and represented Montana on the International Joint Commission's Milk St. Mary River Task Force between 2005 and 2006. Presently, Mr. Moy is the chair of the Flathead Basin Commission, a commission devoted to protecting water quality of the Flathead River Basin and Flathead Lake. He is also leading a Montana delegation of scientists and professionals that participate in the British Columbia regulatory process that is evaluating potential impacts of the proposed mountaintop coal mine in the headwaters of the North Fork of the Flathead River of British Columbia. Mr. Moy received his master's in animal ecology from the University of Montana, and he and his wife have raised 3 children and currently live in Helena, Montana. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Moy.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Now, this is on, correct? What I'd like to do today is talk a bit about the 1909 Boundary Waters Treaty, and I think Elizabeth more or less gave you some good foundation of that. Then I want to talk about why are we so concerned about the Crown of the Continent and Glacier National Park, and why we think this area needs to be protected. I want to talk to you about the Cabin Creek coal mine process that we were involved with from 1985 through 1988, and then discuss what has been going on for the last 10, 15 years, and most recently, last 3 or 4 years, regarding energy development of the BC Flathead and the potential implications and impacts for Montana. And just a couple points on the 1909 Boundary Waters Treaty. This treaty was created between the United States and Great Britain, and one of the issues that forced the governments to work together on this treaty was a dispute on the Milk St. Mary's River. And John Volkman here, who you heard yesterday, did a history of that issue, and it's a really intriguing history on why this issue helped lead to the formation of the Boundary Waters Treaty. But the commission is 6 members, 3 appointed by the President of the United States, 3 by the Prime Minister of Canada. The gentleman with me in this picture is Dennis Shornock, who just lost his job about 6 months ago, and we do not have a U.S. chair for the IJC at this time. And the treaty, what it does with the IJC is that the IJC makes recommendations to governments. The recommendations are not binding, and it's up to the governments to accept those recommendations. And the key provision that we have been working with, and what the IJC actually invoked on the Cabin Creek mine, was Article 4. It was the second paragraph of Article 4 that states, boundary waters and waters flowing across the boundary shall not be polluted on either side to the injury of health or property on the other. And the first time they ever did this was in the Cabin Creek mine. or the Sage Creek mine site. And this is the area that we're concerned about. This is the crown of the continent. And this is called the backbone of the world by the Blackfeet tribes. The BC mines are right up in here. This is Glacier National Park. Flathead Lake is down here. And this area here we call the heart of the crown of the continent. This is the North Fork of the Flathead drainage, or the Transboundary Flathead in this area. The border goes right across through here. And George Bird Grinnell was the one that actually coined the phrase crown of the continent. And we have one place in Glacier National Park that is located right down in this area, right in this area right here is Triple Divide Peak, where waters flow into three oceans, the Arctic, the Pacific, and the Atlantic Ocean. And what is really unique about the crown of the continent is that it's really four ecosystems that converge in one area. But that's why we have such a high biodiversity of flora and fauna species, because we have the prairie species on the Rocky Mountain front, we have species from the southern Rocky Mountains coming up, we have the northern species such as lynx coming down, we also have the maritime species with 80 inches of rainfall in the cedar hemlock rainforest in the west part of Glacier National Park, for example. So again, because of these convergence of these four ecosystems that are converged together in this area called the crown of the continent, we have the highest diversity of plant and animal life found almost anywhere in the lower 48 states. It has absolutely spectacular scenery. Flathead Lake is considered one of the cleanest and largest freshwater lakes in the world. And the region has the highest assemblages of mammals found in North America, 16 carnivore species and 6 ungulate species. And one of the unique things is that this is one of the only areas left in the lower 48 states that has its original complement of carnivore species when Lewis and Clark came through this area. And we've been protecting this area for over 100 years on our side of the border. And there are very unique and special federal designations, there are international designations, and there are other reasons. We have Glacier National Park, called the crown jewel of the national park system. It was created for the benefit of its people and to remain in a natural state unimpaired for future generations. If the BC Flathead was in Alberta, it probably would have been an extension of Waterton Lakes National Park. The first superintendent of Waterton Lakes, Kootenai Brown, said, "We have a three-legged stool here. We only have two legs. We have the Alberta part with Waterton Lakes. We have Glacier National Park. We are missing the BC part." The North Fork, and if this was in the U.S., the Glacier National Park extends to the center of the North Fork River. If it was in Glacier National Park, it would extend it all the way to the headwaters of the basin. The North Fork River is designated wild and scenic. And as you all know, President Bush banned oil and gas exploration on the Rocky Mountain front on our side of the border. It has a federal reserved water right for its in-stream flows to protect the natural conditions of the park. And in addition, there are a number of endangered species that we found in this area. And you know, this is the first international peace park ever created between two governments. It was actually created by the Rotarians in 1932. And we just celebrated 2 weeks ago the 75th anniversary of the first international peace park between Waterton and Glacier. And at that meeting, what was so unique is that there was countries from all over the world that are now looking at and have been creating international peace parks. And this is the first one created by the Rotarians. This glacier is also designated a biosphere reserve. And this plaque is in Logan Pass. And it says, "Glacier is recognized as a part of the International Biosphere Reserves." This network of protected samples of the world's major ecosystem types is devoted to conservation of natural and scientific research in the service of man. It provides a standard against which the effects of man's impacts on this environment can be measured. It is also a World Heritage Site. And this is Waterton Lakes National Park. And when I was a young man, I worked at the headwaters of this lake at Goat Hunt in Glacier National Park, and now my son is up there working. And These two parks, as a World Heritage Site, were designated based on their natural ecological preserves with outstanding universal significance and exceptional natural beauty. The North Fork of the Flathead River is considered one of America's wildest valleys. Glacier National Park extends to the center of this river, and many species of wildlife move across this border, making the Flathead truly a transboundary landscape that must be managed as one integral system. And there's a very unique predator-prey relationship found within this area between the carnivore species and the ungulate species. In fact, we know that a number of species summer in the BC Flathead, winter in Montana, in Glacier National Park, or out of Alberta in Waterton Lakes National Park. It has the highest density of grizzly bears found anywhere in the interior of North America. And it has one of the highest water quality standards that you will find in North America, and absolutely the highest aquatic biodiversity. In fact, biodiversity, if you look at, this is the North Fork in British Columbia, and this is this riparian corridor is almost a mile long. And it has about 80 species of stoneflies, mayflies, and caddisflies, and it has the highest, these type of macroinvertebrates found anywhere in North America. So those are the reasons this area is so special to Montanans and to Americans. Okay, so here's the Transboundary Flathead again. This is the Sage Creek coal mine, or also called the Cabin Creek coal mine, that we assessed in 1985 through 1988 through an IJC reference that I was intimately involved with. And I want to talk about that. Since then, Klein Mine tried to reopen this site, and BC said no. Now they're working on the Lodgepole site. There's also the Lilybird site, which I will show you. We also now have CBM development that's being proposed by British Petroleum. And then on the other side in the Elk River, this is a tributary of the Elk River, Michelle Creek, is the Coal Mountain Mine, which is an existing mine that you can look at to see this is what this area is going to look like. So we'll look at the Coal Mountain Mine. Okay, let's talk about the Sage Creek. The Sage Creek is located 6 miles north of the international border. This is the mine site that they really want. This is 130 million tons of high-grade metallurgic coal. This is the one they really want. If they get the first one in, they get the infrastructure in the basin, then you're going to see a domino effect, and they're all going to be built. And in this one, they're going to take out 2 mountains, and one of the mountains is going to go below Howell Creek by about 100 feet, and the other below Cabin Creek by 325 feet. They want to mine 2.4 million tons of high-grade thermal coal per year for 20 years with the extension of another 20 years. It's going to be operated 365 days a year. They would actually pave the road from this mine site all the way into Morrissey, near Fernie, where then we shipped to Japan for steel production. That was what the proposal was. And they would have 400 people would be located near the mine site during construction. This is the mine. And this is the North Fork of the Flathead River, right over here. This is the North Fork. This is Cabin Creek, and this is Howell Creek. And they would take 2 mountains out and create 2 pits that would actually dewater Cabin and Howell Creeks. And these are the waste dumps. And one of the things in the process is that they told us that the BC regulatory process was very good. And one of the things we always questioned, did you ever have dump failures, or were there ever settling pond failures? During the 3-year process, there were significant dump failures, and a major settling pond went out that was designed for a 100-year flood and went out on a 10-year flood at the Line Creek site. So in the IJC process, the IJC created a reference. And they said, I want you to look at the effluent discharges from this mine site and look at the impacts on the Flathead River, the fishery uses, and all the way down into Flathead Lake. And in order to do that, we created 4 technical teams. And my job as the secretariat for the Flathead International Study Board was to coordinate the work of the technical committees, draft the board report with my counterpart. And so I was intimately involved with the data analysis and the data that was there. So we created 4 major committees. We actually created 7 total, but 4 major committees. The Mine Development Committee, the Water Quality, Quantity, the Biological Resources, and the Water Uses. And the process was a great process that was set up by the IJC. They said, okay, the Mine Development Committee, you look at the effluent discharges that would come from this mine. At the same time, when they were doing that, they had the Water Quality, Quantity, the Biological Resources, and the Water Uses Committee say, now define the baseline condition in this basin. And then we took that effluent discharges onto the baseline condition and said, okay, how will this basin change? And we had 50 scientists on these committees, 25 from the US, 25 from Canada. They worked for 3 years, and they were extremely professional. One thing, the professionalism of the Canadian scientists were absolutely outstanding. And what we found is there would be significant impacts to the fishery, and that the North Fork of the Flathead would actually probably turn green at the border and at some distance downstream. And then one of the things was there's a 3-stage process back then in British Columbia, and they had gone through the stage 2 process. The stage 2 process said is where we have all the data. That's the decision. If you get through stage 2, stage 3 will happen. And when we got involved, we found out there was not a lot of technical data available. So we had to use best professional judgment. We had to use data from other coal mines in the Elk River Valley. Or we just stated we just didn't know the impacts. And today, there is still very little data in the BC Flathead. We've been working for the last 15, 20 years to try to get that data, but we have not been able to do so. But the impact would be on bull trout, cutthroat fisheries, and nutrient loading in the North Fork of the Flathead River. Now, the IJC took these results, and they created this recommendation. And they invoked Article 4 of the Boundaries Water Treaty, which is really a big deal. And that is that you cannot pollute to the detriment of health and the environment across the border. And they said the mine as presently defined and understood not be approved. The mine proposal not receive regulatory approval in the future unless and until it can be demonstrated that. And this is what's really critical. The potential transboundary impacts identified in the report of the Flathead International Study Board have been determined with reasonable certainty and could constitute a level of risk acceptable to both governments. That's the key, acceptable to both governments. And then the impacts, potential impacts on the sport fishery population and habitat in the Flathead system could not occur or could be fully mitigated in an effective and assured manner. And then the third recommendation, which is a really intriguing recommendation that they made. They said, we want the governments with appropriate jurisdictions to look at opportunities for defining sustainable development activities and management strategies in the Upper Flathead River Basin. And we've been working, and 5 different governors, from Schwinden to Stevens to Roscoe to Martz, have been trying to implement this recommendation. And the IJC back then said, look at the Skagit and look at this International Conservation Reserve, which a couple of us put together in a back-foot envelope for the Flathead, and see if you can implement this. And we've been working on that and have not been successful. And one thing is that the BC government never accepted the IJC recommendations. And when the BC government did not accept them, the Canadian federal government did not accept them. BC leads, this land is all Crown land. There's very little Dominion land in the North Fork that is actually owned by the Canadian federal government. It's all owned by the province. The province leads the charge, which is really interesting in that the letter we just received from Premier Campbell on September 14th of this month said they now interpret the recommendations differently. And I'm not sure what that means. But BC back then did not protest the recommendations because coal prices were falling, and they had spent a considerable amount of money in the Northeast Coal Block, and so they just let those ride. And so we've been trying to pursue and implement the third recommendation with BC. And one of the things BC would always say to us, well, we're going through this process. So the first process we worked with them on was the core process, Commission on Resources and the Environment. It was a great process. It was a collaborative, grassroots, stakeholders sitting around a table. We couldn't sit at the table, but we were able to provide input into that process. And the recommendations that came from the core process on land use allocation in the East Kootenai, including the North Fork, were wonderful. They went to Cabinet. Cabinet then decided to change them all and focus on coal development and energy development. We then worked with them on a process that was really a top-down process, which was the Southern Rocky Mountain Wildlife Management Plan. That took about a year, and it had collaboration, it had public involvement, but it was a top-down process, but it focused on wildlife, which was very consistent with what we were trying to accomplish on our side of the border in Glacier National Park, the preservation of wildlife and glacier. When Premier Campbell became elected premier, the first thing he did was throw that one out, start another top-down process that opened up the entire BC Flathead to mining. And it was called the Southern Rocky Mountain Management Plan. We knew before he even started that process what the outcome would be. And I just read in the Premier's letter of this month that said it was a very collaborative process. It actually sought input from Montana, which it did. We commented and we said, this is not a good plan. We do not like this plan. This is not consistent with what we are trying to do on our side of the border. And then things have been more or less quiet for a while until 2004 when Klein tried to open up the Cabin Creek site again, or the Sage Creek mine site. And we got Colin Powell to state that the IJC recommendations, and this is really thanks to Senator Baucus, Senator Baucus back then, and the governor, to put pressure to say those recommendations of the IJC in 1988 still apply to the entire Flathead. Because of that, BC then decided to create a moratorium on this site for 10 years. Now 3.5 years are gone on that moratorium. And then in 2003, they wanted to negotiate an agreement. It was called the Environmental Cooperation Arrangement, or agreement. And it was actually signed in the fall of 2003, and I helped negotiate it on behalf of the governor. And that agreement, the bottom line of that agreement, calls for establishing initiatives to identify, coordinate, and promote mutual efforts to ensure the protection, conservation, and enhancement of our shared environment for the benefit of current and future generations. That's what the agreement says. Since that agreement had been signed, BC has proposed 5 new mining ventures in the BC Flathead, 3 coal mines and 2 for CBM. The reason this picture is here, because this is a lodgepole site. They want to take out this mountain on this side. The Lilybird site that they're exploring is right under the alluvium on the North Fork. Okay, you can see these are the coal blocks. This is the crown of the continent. This is Glacier National Park. This is the Sage Creek site. This is the one they really want. They actually talked about opening up these 2 sites here, but then they decided to back down on Klein Corporation. This is the lodgepole site. This is the Lilybird site. So far, they haven't said anything about this site. This is the Dominion coal block. This is the area for a coal bed methane development that they want to push. And let's talk about the lodgepole process. Governor Schweitzer met with the Premier in August of 2005, and because of that, we've been invited to participate in the process. And right now, the process is putting together the terms of reference for the Klein mine. And this is the Mountaintop mine. And I have a team about a 15-member team working with me on this thing. And we have submitted significant comments on the terms of reference. The terms of reference lays out what needs to be included in the application and the type of environmental work that needs to be done. And one of the things is, in the 1988 IJC reports, at the end of that process, they said, if any new mine is proposed in the BC Flathead, these are the types of data you need to collect in order to make an assessment. We included those comments into our comments on the terms of reference, and basically all our comments to date have been ignored. And right now, we're waiting for the next draft of the terms of reference to come out. We have submitted 3 very significant lists of issues and concerns and data that need to be collected and to be included in the application process. And the terms of reference is what it is. It's really like a recipe. It says, here's what you need to have that needs to go into the application. And this is the lodgepole site. Again, this is the Flathead River. It's about 22 miles to the border. This is Fosey Creek. They want to take this mountain out. And they actually want to take it down. This is a tributary of Fosey Creek, which is Crab Creek. They want to actually go below that. And you can see the coal seams being exposed here. And the processing facility will be right there. And right here is this side. It's very, very steep. It doesn't look steep here, but it is very steep. And I think the ratio amount of rock to coal is 8-to-1, I think. Casey, is that correct? And they want to take 2 millions of very low-grade metallurgic coal, and they want to mix it, as was said, with high-grade coal and sell it. And again, they want to operate that 24 hours a day for 365 days a year for 20 years. And they want to find a place to load it, and they're having a very difficult time finding a place to load it, put it on a rail system, and transport it to China and other Asian countries for steel production. It's interesting. Premier Campbell talks about all the CO2 sequestration and how he's actually signed this agreement with Governor Schwarzenegger. But they send 20 million tons or more of high-grade metallurgic coal to China and Southeast Asia each year, which only does one thing, increase CO2. And the Klein funding is from Japan and Germany and other sources. And they're doing this they're after money. Yet the province this last year had a $6 billion surplus. Here's the team that works with me on doing the assessment of the Klein mine. And I want to show you because it's a very professional team, such as we have the Flathead Lake Biological Station with Jack Stanford and Rick Cower. We have Chris Savina, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We have Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. People of the Flathead Basin Commission, EPA. And Clayton Matt, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribe. And this is the Lilybird site, just to show you where it is underneath the Flathead alluvium and the riparian corridor. They're going to have to completely take this thing out and remove the river, smooth the river system. They're really not saying a lot about this project right now. But one of the things is, since we know that this here is, right over here, is the lodgepole site, and the Lilybird site here, we wanted to really get good information on bull trout. And the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks encountered reds. And reds are really critical because spawning reds in this area. And it found out that in 2003, there were 62 bull trout reds right in this area, directly downstream of Fosey Creek and this mine site. And under the alluvium of the Lilybird site, that represents 37% of the bull trout spawning in the North Fork, 21% of the bull trout spawning in the Flathead Lake. And then 2006, there was 78 reds found in this area. If you look at West Slope cutthroat, when we met with BC on the Klein mine, their fishery biologists told us there were no pure West Slope cutthroat. There were only hybrid rainbow cutthroats. And genetically pure West Slope cutthroat, as you probably all know, only occupy about 10 to 20% of the original home range. And Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks actually went up there and did some shocking studies and found at all these locations, these are all pure West Slope cutthroat populations, even into Crab Creek that's going to be completely decimated. And they also did some tagging this last year of West Slope cutthroat out of Flathead Lake, and they found them coming all the way up into here to spawn. So we also know, and we're trying to get this study out on mid and large-sized carnivores, that if you put this type of infrastructure of mining in the BC Flathead, there will be significant impacts in mid and large-sized carnivores. We do know that entire winter range of mountain goats will be destroyed. Summer ranges for elk and moose will probably be impacted. And the Flathead River will be impacted because you're going to affect recharge into the river from groundwater contamination. And the riparian corridor, one of the most unique riparian corridors you'll find, will be impacted. And as you know, in recent studies in Kentucky and West Virginia on mountaintop mining, The impacts will be irreversible. And one of the things we're doing right now, thanks to the Montana legislature and the Flathead delegation, we're now collecting more baseline data in the Flathead. And Senator Baucus has an appropriation in there for $1.2 million for us to do more work on mid and large-sized carnivores and water quality and fisheries. Okay, this is the proposed lodgepole site, okay? Now we're going to look at the Coal Mountain Mine, because the Coal Mountain Mine is what you're going to see, and the Coal Mountain Mine directly flows into Michelle Creek. This is the Coal Mountain Mine. This is what it's going to look like. This is water, and this is just 10 miles away from the lodgepole site. You're going to take a natural, almost undisturbed ecosystem, and you're going to do this to it. And this is reclamation. You got to see reclamation. They don't reclaim. They just spray stuff and expect it to grow on the tailings. But one of the things is the effect on water quality. You know, I just gone through a tour with British Columbia, and we were tired. It was in the summertime. All I wanted was a beer. It was 90 degrees and higher. And they said, no, we want to show you some data. This is BC data that they showed me. And sulfates in Michelle Creek as compared to the Flathead, BC data, 18 times higher than the Flathead. Nitrates, 650 times higher than the existing nitrate concentration in the Flathead. Selenium is 57 times higher. And what is really interesting on selenium is extremely toxic. And when we worked on the Cabin Creek coal mine, we said there's no data on selenium. And now we find out through the grapevine that there probably was selenium data from the 40 coal mines in the Elk River Valley, which are 5, that was not shared with us. But selenium is very toxic and could have a significant impact on the biota, fishery, and waterfowl, and birds. And then there's also potential for coal bed methane. And we had an interesting discussion last week with British Petroleum in Calgary on coal bed methane. And this is a significant challenge because it's really like a domino effect. If you get the first one in, they're going to all fall. And I don't think we can accept that risk. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moy. Well, wonderful. Well, now that we've had the Montana perspective on the matter, I'm pleased to introduce to you Casey Brennan, who drove all the way from British Columbia last night to be here with us, so we're very fortunate. He is the program manager with WildSite in the Southern Rockies region of Canada. Casey lives with his family in Fernie, British Columbia, and is an active member in his community. He has been working on community and environmental initiatives in the East Kootenay since 1990. Casey became a WildSite program manager in 2002 and focuses on the impacts of mining and gas extraction in the Rockies. He also leads the effort to add part of British Columbia's Flathead Valley to the Waterton Glacier International Peace Park, as Mr. Moy introduced to us. WildSite works locally, regionally, and globally to protect biodiversity and encourage sustainable communities in Canada's Columbia and Southern Rocky Mountain region. This area is internationally recognized as a keystone to conservation in Western North America. If you're interested, you can find more information at www.wildsite.ca. With that, Mr. Brennan, welcome.
I am pleased to be here. Had a lovely drive down last night. Didn't see a lot of wildlife, thankfully. But I did get to see a lot of development in the Flathead Basin. And from a BC perspective, this is something that the Premier likes to highlight and other BC officials like to highlight. And I would have to say that they are making a fairly strong point in terms of what are you guys so concerned about messing up the Flathead for? Look what you're doing with your communities. And I guess the reason why I bring that up is not to undermine the rest of the points that I'm going to make here, but to just point out a fundamental difference between our two countries. There's 10 times the people here that there are in our country. And we have had the great fortune of being able to do a fairly poor job of regulating environmental impacts on our landscape because we don't have the population pressure or the industrial development pressure that you folks have had here on your land base. And I just want to start out by saying that folks in BC have actually very little connection to the crown of the continent and all the sort of the wonderfulness that Rich described and went through in terms of Waterton Glacier Park and all of the values that are wrapped up in the crown of the continent. It's not really been something that's been part of our story on the BC side or in our corner or our third. It's unfortunate, and there's a lot of people trying to work to change that, but it really isn't seen as, we don't take ownership of it nearly the same way that folks in Alberta or in Montana do. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One of the reasons is a long history of resource extraction in the Elk Valley, which is the other major drainage in the crown of the continent in the BC side, and the culture that has brought, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. But it's also because the Flathead is kind of like this forgotten valley, or it has been a forgotten valley in BC. We just call it the Flathead on our side because we don't have a middle fork and a south fork on our side. But it's because of geography and sort of socioeconomic history, it's just kind of been over there, and it goes down into the States just about immediately, and there's not really much, we don't have much to do with it, which is a bad thing in terms of that connection to the crown of the continent that I was just talking about, but it's actually a really good thing in terms of what the landscape still looks like. I guarantee that if the 49th parallel was the 50th parallel, the Flathead would probably have all sorts of people living in it, roads up to the top of it, and various other things going on there. But luckily, it is the 49th parallel, and it has been this place that's over two very high passes that are snowed in for about 6 months of the year, pretty much impossible to get through from about November to May, and has some nice timber back there, and we've been logging away at it for about 60 so years. There have been some looks at minerals for quite some time. There was drilling for oil and gas quite a few years ago. They didn't really find much. There's been various attempts at drilling for oil and gas. One of the first drill rigs in Western North America was actually in the Flathead on the Canadian side. But they've never really found anything of significance other than the timber. So we've been very fortunate in that that's all we've really been doing as far as the human thing goes on the Canadian side in the Flathead. So we still have this wonderful pristine watershed despite our British Columbia and Canada's appalling record of stewardship. And just to sort of back that up, I guess, I'll talk about a book a friend of mine wrote. David Boyd wrote a book called Unnatural Law, and David Boyd's a lawyer from Salt Spring Island, close to Victoria, between Victoria and Vancouver, just off of Vancouver Island. He actually worked with Prime Minister Paul Martin, the previous Prime Minister, and the Privy Council, but he's been a lecturer and a adjunct professor for both UVic and UBC. And he wrote this book, which is a comparison of environmental regulations and environmental legislation throughout the entire OECD, and found that out of the 28 countries, Canada comes in pretty much 28th on most criteria. And we're not really doing much to change that in any big hurry since he wrote that book in just beginning of this decade. And as I said, the reason why we continue to enjoy this great reputation worldwide, I taught English in Taiwan for a while, and when I told people I was from Canada, they'd say, "Oh, Canada, nature, beautiful," kind of as their first sentence to me, and we'd all say yes. And I guess, it's because there's only just over 30 million of us. We all live just about within 200 miles of the U.S. border, and we've got the second largest country in the world, so there's a whole bunch of land that we just haven't got to yet, and a whole bunch of water that we just haven't got to yet. And so that's one of the things we were discussing, Rich and I, when we were at this Peace Parks and Partnerships conference a couple of weeks ago, was that in Canada, the Flathead isn't really that big a deal. You know, it's just another pristine river. We've got dozens, if not hundreds of them. And so people in Canada don't really get it. They don't understand, it's just another, what are you making a big deal out of this for? Go away. It's not even a big river. It's just a little piece of river. It's clean, but, we've got way better rivers up north, kind of thing. And Rich made a really strong point that, and he's made it here again today, that for you guys, this is sort of one of the last of the great rivers that's left that's in its original condition. And the point that we've been trying to make, I work for a nonprofit organization. We do have 501c status, so if you want to sign a check and hand it to me, I can get you a tax receipt later. But what we've been working on is trying to show people that actually the Flathead is actually a really big deal in southern Canada. As I mentioned, about 80% of us live within 200 miles of the U.S. border, and there just isn't another valley the size of the Flathead along our entire border, even past the 49th into the Great Lakes and up and through the St. Lawrence area, where there is such a large alluvial floodplain that's been undisturbed. It hasn't been restricted or constrained in any way so that people can do the human thing without being worried about some big river coming, washing them out or anything like that. There isn't anything like that really along the entire rest of the border, and it's very unique and it's very special and it's worthy of protection. And in fact, as my introduction stated, I've been working really hard to try and get that protection. We're trying to make it a part of the national park, and national parks in Canada have sort of a 5-stage process they have to go through. We've made it through sort of the National Beauty Contest, which is stage 1. Let's look around and see where the nice places are. Okay, yeah, it's nice there. Let's do a detailed analysis and see if there's enough representativeness, new representativeness that would be added to the system, the national park system, because there's already a whole bunch of Rocky Mountain parks. Why would we need another one of those? Oh, well, actually, geez, the Flathead is would add a low elevation alluvial floodplain with huge amounts of biodiversity that don't exist in our other Rocky Mountain parks. Yeah, I guess it gets, not I guess, it passes that next stage 2 with flying colors. Now we're sort of stalled out at stage 3, which is a comprehensive feasibility study, which would look at the socioeconomic impacts as well as the environmental impacts of it being included in the park. And the reason we're stalled out is exactly as Rich mentioned, is it's BC Crown land. It's not federal land. It's over 85% of British Columbia is owned by the province. And they own all the land in this neck of the woods. And if they don't say, yes, the feasibility study can go ahead, we would be interested in signing this land over to you if the feasibility study comes out good, then the federal government doesn't want to go ahead and spend the money on the feasibility study because they don't have any assurance that it could ever become a park. So we're working really hard to try and change the provincial government's mind, but I'm not holding my breath, unfortunately. And the reason for that is, as Rich mentioned, we've got a wonderful provincial government that has brought in what they, it's sort of actually the first thing they did before they rescinded that wildlife management area in the East Kootenays was establish their 2-zone mining policy, which says that everywhere in the province, unless it's already in a park or a protected area, is open to mining in oil and gas. and that oil and gas and mining is the highest and best use of the land, and it trumps all other issues. And in the Southern Rocky Mountain Management Plan, which is the sort of third, if not fourth iteration of land use plan in our neck of the woods in the Kootenays, actually says that right in the outset in sort of chapter 3, which is sort of the definitions chapter, says all of the other things that you're going to hear about later in this plan, like riparian corridor protection, old growth management areas, wildlife connectivity, core grizzly bear habitat, doesn't really matter if there's an oil and gas or a mining interest. That trumps everything else. And so this, actually, it's a very good plan. It's well written by, as Rich said, excellent, very professional scientists who did a great job of all those other values that I just mentioned. It's completely kneecapped by this policy. And this is the result, what you just went through with Rich, these multiple proposals for the landscape is the result of that. And that there is no real say of land use planners or folks like myself who sit on the Southern Rocky Mountain Advisory Committee, which is the citizen panel that is charged with implementation of this land use plan. There is no real say about, and we've brought it up multiple times with ministers sitting in front of us, the minister responsible and minister of land sitting there saying, what about cumulative impacts? What about the effects of all of these multiple things if they go ahead on the land and the wildlife and all of the other values that are in this plan? And the answer has been, well, we've got a 2-zone mining policy, so that's why, and we're open for business. And I guess I'd say that the environmental regulations in Canada and in BC are pretty shot through with politics. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is the difference in government systems that we have between the two countries. We have a parliamentary system that concentrates a huge amount of power at what you guys would call the executive level, at the Premier's office or the Prime Minister's office. And there is no real check on that power in our political system. They pretty much direct all policy and all regulatory decision making. Yes, there is a body of law and a case law, a history of case law in that. But with our first past the post electoral system, which gives majorities generally, we have an exception federally right now, to the governing party, if there's a problem with some kind of a successful litigation under any existing legislation that doesn't suit the party in power or the regime in power, then they can just change the law at the next sitting of the parliament and to tweak it so that the case law that's just been established by some successful litigation doesn't apply anymore. And that is done, sort of like a snap of the fingers. It's not like here where, if that was attempted, then there would be so many sort of checks, to use a polite term, in the system, that the thing would get gummed up and it probably wouldn't happen for, half a decade if you're lucky, kind of thing. And that's one of the reasons why your current federal administration has been so successful at getting some of that changed, is because they got this wonderful second term and they've been able to sort of push things through, and I won't go into that. But Rich mentioned sort of a wonderful case in point, though, of how shot through with politics our land use regulatory process is. When he was talking about the no coal staking reserve that was established right up against the border that precluded Klein Mining, who's the same proponent for the Lodgepole mine that Rich went into extensively, from reigniting that Sage Creek mine, and pretty much nipped it in the bud only maybe less than 6 months before, from the time that they proposed it. They just played politics, and it's a pretty interesting story, and if you bear with me, I'll go into it a little bit. The Minister of Mines actually came to Fernie for a community meeting about coal bed methane. Thought they'd had the room stacked with a whole bunch of friendlies, pro-business types and pro-mining types and stuff. for this community panel that quite a bit of media had shown up to, because we had created quite a bit of controversy about a 10-year sale, a 40,000 hectare 10-year sale that they wanted, about 100,000 acres, that they wanted to put through just adjacent to Fernie. And so he came to do this community panel, and lo and behold, all these folks that he thought he'd had stacked, that he thought his staff had they'd stacked the room with, stood up and said, "This is a mess. We don't want this. There have been huge problems with this already. You guys got to get your head screwed on straight." And so the story that was going to come out from this staged event that they put together was BC not doing a good job of regulating land use. And so he must have gotten on the phone. So that was the evening session. There was another session the next morning. He must have gotten on the phone with some of the cabinet members. The next morning, he said, "Yeah, I don't have a whole lot of time to talk. Nice to hear you. Nice to hear more community input. I got a big announcement. I'm going to take the media outside and have this scrum and make this big announcement about this no staking reserve, so that we can spin the story that comes out of this about government doing something about the land base." So that's the kind of power they have on our side of the border, to just be able to sort of react and make exceptions to this two-zone mining policy, which said before that they were completely open to business everywhere. Oh, except when the politics suits us, and we'll put this little piece off limits for a decade, kind of thing. And the environment, I'm just going to, I'll be very frank, I'm not very well prepared for this, but I've got a few notes here, and I'm going to try to jump around. I didn't really get a good narrative arc to my presentation, I'm afraid, but I think I want to talk next about the environmental assessment process, and Rich talked a bit about that, and just talk about how political that is, and how much influence there is on that process. So the process is designed to get to yes, which is a direct quote from Bill Bennett, our MLA, member of the Legislative Assembly, the provincial house or provincial legislature, who was the Minister of State for Mining, which is sort of a junior cabinet position, subordinate to the Minister of Energy, Mines and Petroleum Resources. They have the Environmental Assessment Office is supposedly an arm's length body that looks at industrial proposals, mining, large-scale commercial real estate proposals, large-scale development proposals, and those kind of things, and makes a recommendation to the minister. And the minister then takes that recommendation and either approves a certificate, an environmental assessment certificate, or rejects the certificate. Well, until last week, they had never not recommended that a project be approved. But we had our first no recommendation from the Environmental Assessment Office ever last week on Northgate Minerals' proposal for a mine in north central BC called Chemist North, where they were proposing to use a lake for a tailings pond, completely kill a lake, fish-bearing lake, which was also the headwaters of two rivers, which were a water supply for two First Nations communities. And the First Nations, and it was interesting, there's a fair bit of assessment of, wow, this is amazing, this is groundbreaking, revolutionary. Why did this happen? How could this happen? Well, most of the pundits that were looking at this said, well, it's because of the First Nations, because there is such a strong sort of mounting body of case law around First Nations rights and title that if they had said yes, these guys would have gone to court. It would have been tied up for at least a decade anyways, and the First Nations the court system would have probably found in favor of the First Nations, and this mine wouldn't have been allowed anyway. So they figured they'd just sort of short-circuit that and recommend a no and avoid all that legal hassle and trouble. And I think that's probably the bulk of the reason why it was a no, but I think also part of the reason why it's a no is because we've been raising quite a bit of stink about this lodgepole mine and getting quite a good bit of press in Vancouver and Victoria, making the point that there has never been a no, the process is designed to get to yes, sort of holding the government accountable on this fact. And so I think there might have been a bit of pressure as well there to come up with a no so they can say, see, it's all yes. But I might just be too much of a conspiracy theorist for academic circles anyways. I will just mention that the Tanaha First Nation, who are closely related, if not intimately related, to the Kootenai Salish, are the First Nation who have traditional territory rights and title in our neck of the woods. And they are currently in the BC treaty process. It's a joint federal provincial process. They have been making presentations, community presentations, and they are getting close to an agreement in principle. So the First Nation in our neck of the woods is actually has been extremely tight-lipped about all of these proposals, which is not always the case in other areas of British Columbia. And First Nations interests and politics and claims to rights and title have been a major factor in the last decade, and particularly in the last 5 years, on these types of industrial proposals. So I mentioned earlier that the Elk Valley and the communities in the Elk Valley have been founded and are continued to have a foundation, socioeconomic foundation of mining, coal mining. And Rich mentioned that there's 5 mines operating in the Elk Valley, producing over 20 million tons of processed metallurgical coal, which is shipped by rail. Almost all of it is shipped to Vancouver, and they supply, this company, one company, which is the merger of 3 companies, supplies over 1/5 of the world's steelmaking coal that is shipped in the world. And so one of the points that we've been making is we've already got 1/5 of the world's steelmaking coal coming out of this area. How much more do we need to be producing for the benefit of the province and all of those things? And how much is enough? And the answer that we get back from anybody that has any interests in coal mining, both from the government and the industry side, is, well, you can't use that argument. It's not fair. Every company has the right to pursue development of this resource. Just because there's one company in here now doesn't mean it should preclude other companies' rights to be able to develop this resource. And that's kind of like saying what it seems to be to me that folks are saying on this side of the line around residential development or commercial development, property development. And I guess this is what I wanted to conclude with. It's actually quite amazing, the difference between Canada's zoning laws and commercial and residential property development laws, and how we're quite strict on those things, and there's quite a lot of restriction on what can be done within the built environment, within communities, way more than there is in the States, and way more restriction on private property than there is in the States. And how the flip to that is how lax our regulation is on Crown land, on federal and provincial land particularly, and how that's not the case in the U.S. And I think there's a couple reasons for that that are mentioned in Sarah Hurd's paper that's included in the package. And I think that one of the biggest ones is the different level of involvement of the federal government in the United States, and the evolution of the federal government's regulation and body of and case law in the U.S., and how that's resulted from the different political systems that I described earlier. And it's also the difference between the cultures in the two countries. We're very peace, order, and good government kind of folks, and you guys are sort of wild, wild west kind of folks. And I don't have much more intelligent to say than that, but I appreciate your attention, and I'll get out of your way.
Thank you, Mr. Brennan. I don't know what it means to be a wild, wild west type of folk, but it sounds good to me. Next, we have a representative from our third sovereign to give a perspective today, and that is Rich Jensen. And Rich is an enrolled citizen at the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes, where he is the division manager of the environmental protection for the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes. He has spent his entire 15-year career with the tribes, and with the last 5 years he has served in his role as division manager. In this position, he is charged with ensuring the protection of the environment and health and well-being of the residents within the exterior boundaries of the Flathead Indian Reservation and the Aboriginal territories of the Salish, Pend Oreille, and Kootenai people. Over the past 5 years, Rich has created the brownfield, solid waste, pesticides, and most recently, the underground storage tank programs for the tribes. He is currently serving as the U.S. EPA Region 8 Tribal Representative to the National Tribal EPA Science Council and is the Tribal Representative to the Lake County Solid Waste Board of Directors, as well as being Secretary of the Salish Kootenai Holding Company Board of Directors. Rich received his Master's in Business Administration from Gonzaga University this year and his Bachelor of Science in Forest Resource Management from the University of Montana in 1993. He and his wife had 2 children, and they reside in the Flathead Indian Reservation in Ronan, Montana. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Jansen.
Thank you. Good morning. I was told about this presentation just last week, so bear with me. My supervisor, Clayton Matt, who is on the technical team with Rich Moy, could not attend today, so I said, yeah, I'll come down and see my old alumni. The school has changed quite a bit since 1993. For the better, I guess. Anyway, as was alluded to earlier, I guess I want to make sure that everybody realizes that the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes are 2 distinct, different tribes. And the Ktunaxa band in Canada are a Kootenai band that are connected to our Kootenai band in Pablo. And the Salish tribes include numerous tribes, including the Kalispel, Pend Oreille, Upper and Lower, the Coeur d'Alene, Nez Perce, and many other coastal Salish tribes here in the States. But the fact remains on mining in the British Columbia area, the tribes right now have an interest of these projects because of the fact that it lies within Aboriginal territories that were normal roaming areas of our tribes. And we also have a very big stake in Flathead Lake because we own and manage the south half of Flathead Lake, the bed and banks of that lake. You just want me to put it down? Okay. I just want to make sure you guys can hear me. That's all. Can you hear me? Okay, sorry about that. And the fact that we have our own water quality standards on the south half of Flathead Lake. So, our goal is to protect the resources within the exterior boundaries of the reservation and our Aboriginal territories. And when you take an issue of coal mining and coal bed methane mining in another country, that more than likely will affect the tribes, the environment, and our way of life. It is something that we are monitoring right now. We have yet to speak with the Ktunaxa Band of Canada, So really, all our role is right now, and our position is that we are monitoring what is happening in Canada, and we do support the comments that have been provided by the state of Montana. And as a part of the Flathead Basin Commission, my supervisor's role, Clayton Matt, is just that. He is on the Flathead Basin Commission as a member of the Salish and Kootenai tribes, a representative of the tribes, and we support our technical comments so far. I'm not going to get into too much more of my presentation because I believe Casey and Rich already covered the majority of the stuff that I was going to put into my presentation, so thank you. I can cut mine short. I really appreciate that. But anyway, Clayton Matt, he gave me a 4-slide presentation, and this is what you see now in British Columbia, and this is what potentially could come about of it if you see coal and coal bed methane mining in British Columbia in the future. Now you can see where the Flathead Reservation is located, and Missoula is just below, Missoula is just below the southern boundary of the reservation. And you can see our boundaries encompass the south half of Flathead Lake. And we do work very well in concert with the Montana Department of Environmental Quality, Montana DNRC, etc. So we want to ensure that Flathead Lake remains pristine and clean, and nothing affects that. But if you can see up above that dot where some mining projects have been proposed, more than likely pollution is going to come downstream and affect our whale life. So essentially, coal mining and coal bed methane mining, drilling in the upper Flathead drainage in British Columbia threaten our way of life, the environment, and will likely, just like I said, send contaminants downstream into the waters of the United States, waters on our Aboriginal territories, and waters onto the reservation, namely Flathead Lake, and continue downstream. Right now, we believe that such actions are unacceptable, and the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes will continue to monitor these activities and participate in transboundary discussions with British Columbia, Klein Mines, and British Petroleum. The only other mine that my government wanted me to mention this morning was the Rock Creek mine that is being proposed, I believe, in the Cabinet Mountains Wilderness near Libby, Montana. This mine is owned and operated by Revert Mining Company, which also owns the Troy mine. And this Rock Creek mine would remove 10,000 tons of copper and silver ore per day from under the Cabinet Wilderness area, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Again, it will impact threatened and endangered species such as the grizzly bear and spawning tributaries of the bull trout, which incidentally, both those species are a species of special concern for the Salish and Kootenai tribes. The Rock Creek mine would also have numerous direct impacts on our cultural resources. And essentially right now we're still just watching what's developing with that mine. Essentially, again, I want to thank Casey and Rich for going through the majority of the stuff before I got up here. So I'm going to conclude with this. Just proposed mining in the Cabinet Mountain Wilderness threatens the environmental quality of life, and again, lies within our Aboriginal territory. We have met with the mining company to express our concerns with the project, and will continue to monitor this project and consider our options as we move into the future. The goal is protecting our resources for future generations, 7 generations out. So if you can understand that, that is what I've been taught and learned, that you want to protect our resources for 7 generations out. So essentially, you guys did a wonderful job before me, so I am done. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jason. So that leaves us, if our panelists will now move into the 3 chairs behind me, that leaves us with approximately 20 minutes 4 questions. So we'll open the floor now to questions. Does anybody have something they'd like to ask our panelists? Yes.
I don't know whether this is for one of the panelists or even for you, Professor Cronk. I spent several years as director of the Colorado Department of Natural Resources, and all of our regulatory agencies, from the Water Conservation Board to the Oil and Gas Commission, the Mineland Reclamation Board, all the agencies with regulatory authority over these kinds of applications are all required to address the impacts of that application, but none of them, not one of them, has any legal authority at all to address cumulative impacts. You mentioned this in your opening, and I'm just wondering if there's a different legal hook either in Montana or on the other side of the international boundary that we don't have in Colorado for getting at that issue.
Casey, do you want to?
Sure, I can start. On the Canadian side, the British Columbia Environmental Assessment process does not take in the cumulative impact, but Canadian Environmental, the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act does, and
Can we use a bad microphone?
yeah, okay.
You look foolish.
Oh, hi there. That one really works. Sorry about that. So the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act does include language in, now I'm going to not trip up on legal terminology, but sets out a procedure, process for incorporating cumulative impact assessment. The Canadian Environmental Assessment Act is not always triggered by different projects. We've been told that the Klein mine, the proposed lodgepole mine, has triggered a Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, and there's a blended process between Canada and BC that they've negotiated under a memorandum of understanding that the two panels will become one, and that they will look at cumulative impact assessment. Right now, what we've been hearing is that the Department of Fisheries and Oceans is going to be the responsible agency at the federal level, and that they are trying to limit the scope of the assessment to the mine footprint and the haul road only, and this is something that they can do under their regulations. So they're going to look at just the area that's impacted by the mine in terms of the tailings and the spoils and the waste dumps, and then the 40-kilometer haul road out, and not any further downstream benefits. Yeah, right. Impacts, and we're pushing hard for that to not become the reality of that review. But that's the kind of game that the Department of Fisheries and Oceans often plays, because the Fisheries Act is actually one of the broadest, in terms of language, the broadest environmental regulations we have in Canada. It regulates, it prohibits the depositing of deleterious substances in any fish-bearing stream, in any major fish-bearing stream, and it's a fairly broad language, and it has a fair amount of gives a fair amount of direction in terms of the regulation of it. So what the Department of Fisheries and Oceans' response to that is to try and limit their scope of assessment as much as they possibly can, so they don't have to look at too much in terms of what's going to hurt the fish. And I will say that in Montana, from Sarah Hurd's comparative analysis, that there is scope for that for cumulative impacts. But I'll let Rich talk more about that, because I'm sure he knows all about it.
Well, let me just give you some comments on the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. It was really a race to see who could actually send the first letter, whether it was the governor or our senators or the Ministry of Ocean and Fisheries, to the Canadian federal government to initiate it. What we have asked for a Section 47 SIA analysis, and we have asked for we wanted to be comprehensive, we wanted to be cumulative, we wanted to be transboundary, and we have asked for an international review panel. And so far, when we first only had the Klein mine, what we heard from the Canadian side is that they have agreed to a comprehensive. The Ministry of Fisheries wanted to only do the footprint of Crab Creek, which is that small tributary that would be completely mined out. But they have gone to a comprehensive. What that comprehensive will entail, we do not know. What we also are very interested in is the date of that letter. Whoever was the first in the race to get to the Canadian federal government gets the petition. And what we are been told, and have not seen the letter, is that the Ministry of Fishery and Oceans beat the governor's letter. In addition, we just had the two senators sent a joint letter to the Canadian ambassador requesting now, since now we have coal bed methane in there and the Klein mine, we think you need to look at a Section 47, and we really want this international review panel very badly. And what BC does not want that. BC got a black eye on the Cabin Creek coal mine with this Transboundary, 50 scientists working on that issue that said no. And they don't want to see that. And so the Canadian ambassador came back and said, no, you were second in the race. And so we're now just waiting to see what this will look like, what is meant by comprehensive under a Section 5 and not a Section 47 analysis under SEA. We're not done.
Yes.
Actually, I have two questions, and the first is for Casey and Rich, and especially thank you, Casey, for the perspective you've brought down here. Is quite enlightening. But Rich, you may recall back in the late 1970s, there was a Saskatchewan proposal up on the Poplar River. And at that time, the Saskatchewan Power Corporation went in and basically condemned farm property 2 miles from the North Montana-Saskatchewan border and started construction of a coal-fired power plant. And you and I were both involved in that project at that time. And at the party in control then was the NDP, as I recall. And the only thing that really caught their attention in terms of their aggressive development of that proposal was that the local farmers whose land was condemned formed barricades and got their rifles out of their gun cabinets and formed barricades there and invited the Prime Minister to please engage in a discussion about that proposal, and that eventually led to the IJC reference. And one of the things that education I got through that process was the big difference in political parties there as here. So I was just wondering, in terms of Canadian politics and BC politics, in terms of looking at the present Prime Minister and regime, looking forward, how does that look? Is that going to stay the same, but sort of an assessment going forward on the political situation within the province up there? And secondly, a question for Rich, while I'm up, in regards to Rich Jansen, with regard to the Kootenai Band, and in thinking back on the Kootenai Falls battle to where the Kootenai bands got involved across the border, and of course the Salish Kootenai Band in Montana in defeating the Kootenai Falls project. There was definitely a transboundary collaboration there with the Kootenays, and just wondering, in terms of that possibility here, your thoughts on that.
You want to go first, Rich?
You can go ahead.
Okay. Well, as far as the politics in BC goes, the party in power are the Liberals, but as many federal Liberals try to tell us, they're not real Liberals. And so just a little history, it's unnecessary, but it's funny and interesting. The party that ruled BC for a long time was called the Social Credit Party, very right-wing. There are a couple of Bennetts, a father and son, were premier for most of the 60s and 70s. And they were all about building dams and, building roads and all those kind of things, and opening up the hinterland, and that was pretty much the deal. And then this nut job, Bill Vander Zalm, took over and got his hand caught in the cookie jar, graft from developers and stuff, and totally discredited the Social Credit Party, and they basically got washed out and defeated themselves, and the NDP came in and ruled for most of the 90s. And the Social Credit Party reorganized themselves, took over the BC Liberal Party, and are now the BC Liberal Party. They've been in for most of this decade, and Premier Campbell is doing a good job of cozying up to folks like Arnold Schwarzenegger, and the Gorick will be there next week, and he'll be sharing the stage with him, and saying the right things on climate change. We're still looking for the small print or even the large print in terms of actually what they're going to do. But the fact of the matter is that the economy's running good. We've got the Olympics coming in 2010 to Vancouver Whistler, and the elections in 2009. I really can't see these guys getting, unless we get like a wag the dog type of situation. It's going to be pretty tough for these guys to lose in 2009.
I guess I can't really address much on BC politics except to say that when Premier Campbell became elected, he took almost all the seats. I think there was only two. That's right. 2 seats, and at the last election about 2 years ago, he almost lost his majority. But he's in a very strong position, and that's because he's tied to Governor Schwarzenegger and has done some really good things for the province, so he has strong support. But you mentioned a very good point, and when you look at the East Popular with Saskatchewan, one of the things there is that Saskatchewan just took 90% of the East Fork of the Popular River and built that Coronach Reservoir and for those 2 coal-fired generation facilities. They just took it, built it, then after the fact, we had an IJC reference that actually agreed to a recommendation on the apportionment. So that was the first experience I had with Canadian politics and Canadian issues in the International Joint Commission, and so that's one thing. And the other thing is regarding Native Americans and the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribe. Clayton Matt is the chairman of our Transboundary Committee on the Flathead Basin Commission. And both Clayton has been intimately involved with us, and he's been absolutely wonderful. And it's my understanding that they have actually had some discussions with the Ktunaxa tribes. But you probably know better than I.
Thank you. Well, what I was told by Clayton Matt, they are trying to meet with the Ktunaxa band. The Ktunaxa have been very quiet on this issue, and we really haven't, Salish and Kootenai tribes really haven't made a position yet except that we are monitoring and watching what's happening up there in British Columbia. But I do know, Pat, that that's a possibility to get the Kootenai and Salish down here in concert with the Ktunaxa Kootenai band in Canada and potentially do something. But we're still waiting because the Ktunaxa really haven't told us if they're for or against the coal bed methane up there. At least that's my understanding.
Yeah, I'll just tell you, there's significant negotiations ongoing with the Ktunaxa by British Petroleum and British Columbia. And I think it's absolutely critical for the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes and the Ktunaxa to get together and start talking, because I think the Ktunaxa are looking at royalties. And I think that's going to hurt us.
Next question? Yes?
Very quickly. This is for Rich Moy. Professor Cronk mentioned the idea of another reference to the IJC, I assume to reopen the order, but then you didn't mention it, so I'm curious whether you see that in the future and what you hope to get out of it.
To me, it's an issue of timing, John. I think I'd rather see us work through this comprehensive SIA process, whatever that's going to look like, because that will provide us with an opportunity to collect 2 or 3 years of more baseline data. And I want to see that first, because every bit of data that we collect is going to help us on addressing issues. And then I think at some point we'll have another IJC reference. The concern is why will that IJC reference be different and the recommendations, because BC may not accept them like they did back in 1988, And we want finality. And one of the things is that, Casey made a very good point here in that, we have problems on our side of the border with growth. And I'll tell you, the Flathead Basin Commission is, in fact, this next month is holding a large lakes conference to try to define tools. And we're doing this in cooperation with the Confederated Salish Kootenai Tribe and with the Flathead Lakers. And it's for the politicians and the leaders and the county commissioners of the basin to look at growth and how we can do a better job of managing growth and still protecting water quality of the Flathead Basin. That's the focus of that conference, and it's going to be in 3 weeks. And okay. And so we just need to collect additional data first. But there is a chance that there will be a reference. And the other issue is that in 1988 they invoked Article 4 of the Boundary Waters Treaty. The question is, what if we took that to an international court where you actually invoked Article 4 of a treaty that's not being abided by another country? And one of the things we're also going to look at is that we understand that, North Dakota is wanting to pass water from Devil's Lake into Manitoba and Lake Winnipeg, and it's our understanding that Manitoba filed a lawsuit in I think either a U.S. court in North Dakota, and we're able to stop it, which is an interesting. And so we want to check that. And in fact, we're in the process of looking at that right now.
I'll just jump in on that. That's the Devil's Lake issue is one of the first things that any Canadian politician and even any politically astute Canadian bureaucrat sort of throws out there in terms of an excuse for not doing the right thing in the Flathead. It's a pretty sore point, and not just pretty. It's an open wound, in fact. And so, these things don't occur in isolation. And the previous questioner mentioned the issue in Saskatchewan that I wasn't aware of, but there's a long, wonderful history of all sorts of different transboundary water issues, and it'd be real nice if we could all be adult about it and just go, okay, well, let's look at the merits and the issues of this one on its own basis, but that seems to be difficult.
You talked about your environmental assessment board gave a no. What does that mean? Does that mean no, go back and redesign your project, or does it close land?
Well, that's quite interesting, and again, I'll reference the excellent thesis in the package by Sarah Hurd, just in terms of the differences between the way the environmental assessment works in BC and Canada and the way it works in Montana and the U.S. The environmental assessment in BC comes first. Before a detailed design of the mine is actually put together. And it looks at sort of broad scale and scope issues in terms of what might be showstoppers for this mine going ahead. It doesn't look at, okay, well, you've designed your tailings pond and you've designed your your loadout facility and you need to, that's no good, this is no good. It's more of a much higher, not 30,000 foot, but maybe like about 5,000 foot scale of analysis. And then it goes through the mine permitting process if it's granted an environmental assessment certificate, and that's in BC. And so what this recommendation to the minister to deny the certificate, an environmental assessment certificate for this proposed mine, was based largely on the sort of the broad concept that we're going to use this lake as a tailings pond.
I think we have time for one more question.
I guess this question would probably be more for Casey, but what can we do on this side of the border as activists or as people concerned about this to try to affect some positive change in Canada without seeming hypocritical and without seeming like we're, overdeveloping our area and asking you guys not to develop yours? Are there some concrete actions we can take or some specific things we can do that'll help push this process along and help us achieve our goals?
That's a great question. Thanks very much. Yeah, there's lots of great things you can do. I'd say the first thing that you can do, the thing that's been most valuable for for us, for activists like myself on the Canadian side, is to continue to support the data gathering that's going on, that is being proposed for further funding. Support Senator Baucus in his efforts to get that money put towards further data collection. That's hugely important to establishing the baseline, establishing a case for the quality, the pristine nature of this area, and it's work that's not being done by Canadian officials. Unfortunately, it's a matter of money, and it's a matter of political priority in terms of why it's not being done on our side. Certainly was a recommendation from the IJC panel that Rich has discussed at length and was agreed to. That's something that BC did agree to, was we're going to do a better job of collecting data, and they simply haven't done that really. So I give strong support to your elected representatives, the senators, and the governor for continuing to put money towards the good science that's being done on our side of the line. The other thing that you can do is encourage. You can give us money, of course, but I won't say that again. I promise. No, you can write thoughtful, handwritten letters to our premier. We've been able to generate. I think we generated through a bunch of lists about 60,000 emails to the Environmental Assessment Office, and they were CC'd to the governor's office. It crashed the governor's email system for a day or so. But what the result of that was, because so many of them were form letters, is the Environmental Assessment Office just threw them out. They just didn't even weren't even going to look at them. I encouraged them to at least look at the file size to see if they were all just the form letter, or if some people had actually added their own comments, and they assured me they did that. I don't know whether they did or not. We're still waiting for that terms of reference to come back, but a handwritten letter to the premier would have incredible value, and just to say, I know the message that I was talking about at the beginning that Rich put out there is, please consider that you hold the power to over protecting one of our last great rivers, kind of thing.
The other thing, too, is that when you read Premier's letter of this month to the governor, he opened the door just a sliver. And what he said, he talked about reciprocity. And one of the things that we're going to start looking at is the oil and gas leases that are in existence on the Flathead National Forest of the North Fork. And there are about 110 leases in existence that they've been set on because of the Connor decision. And there's been no oil and gas leasing has been done in the Flathead by the North Fork for 50 to 100 years, but there are leases out there. And we're looking at the option of, we want reciprocity. If we want BC not to be mining, we need to do the same thing on our side of the border in the BC, in our side of the Flathead. We're looking at that.
Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time. I'd just like to make a few last points to conclude. First, thank you very much to our panelists. I really enjoyed all of your presentations, and I appreciate you taking the time and driving here to share with us your perspectives and your information. I think I can speak for us all when I say that we benefited from having you here today. Second, I'd like to let you know that obviously you've probably picked up from today's presentations that there are people, government organizations with differing perspectives. The Law Review did extend invitations to representatives from the Klein Mine and from British Columbia government, but they declined those invitations, so they were unable to join us today. And last but not least, I would really like to thank the students from the Public Lands Law Review for putting the time and effort into today's panel. A lot of them are sitting over here and are over here. I again, very, very impressed with the work that you've done, and especially bringing this important topic to us here today. So thank you very much.